get in trouble. Get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and redeem the soul of the nation. Do you know who said that? Indeed, the late John Lewis said this on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama on March 1st, 2020, commemorating the tragic events of Bloody Sunday, which occurred in March of 1965. In an article by Rashawn Ray of the Brookings Institute, he summarizes 5 things that Lewis taught us about getting in good trouble. And here they are. Vote always. Never too young to make a difference. Speak truth to power. Become a racial equity broker. Never give up. Can't go into all 5 of those this morning, but we will unpack a couple of them. If you'd like the link to that article, I'm happy to share that with you. Just let me know. John Lewis was a young man when he began his social activism and civil disobedience. At the original march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Lewis was only 25 years old, but there had been years of activism and learning and growing prior to that. 5 years before that, at the age of 20, Lewis spoke at the historic March on Washington during a volatile, oppressive time. We also live in a time of turbulence, a time in which young people are fed up. They have grown up with the Oklahoma City bombing, with 9/11, with climate change, with mass incarceration, mass shootings, systemic inequity, police brutality, to mention only a very few of the characteristics of this era. The young John Lewis's America was defined by racial segregation, lynchings that were never prosecuted, unjust detainment and imprisonment, brutal backlash against peaceful protesters, inequity of every kind and on every level. As a young man, Lewis criticized the Kennedy administration, stating that the black community could not be silent anymore. They could not be patient. Too many people were dying. This young John Lewis reminds me of a current young activist by the name of David Hogg, who founded March for Our Lives after living through the horrific Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida in 2018. He was a high schooler then. He's 22 now. Hogg, along with others, have organized a massive youth movement protesting gun violence. And in the past week, he has spoken and tweeted non-stop, including speaking out against the Biden administration. His anger and his profanity-laced rhetoric has made some enemies, he admits. Is that good trouble? Is it necessary for any movement to happen? Another Gen Z force that has to be reckoned with is a woman by the name of Olivia Juliana, who is a political science student and a strategist for the activist collective Gen Z for Change. She chooses not to use her surname to protect her privacy, with good reason. Following reprehensible language aimed at her by a sitting member of Congress, she used his cruelty to activate her followers to support Gen Z for Change. On their website, this entity defines itself as a nonprofit organization leveraging social media to promote civil discourse, political action among our, that is the Gen Z, generation, end quote. Since July 23rd, just over a week ago, the day of this insulting comment, Olivia has raised over $2.1 million as of this morning. And her commentary is this: we have now turned hatred into healthcare, and people across the country will be able to get access to abortion services because of it. These young people are unafraid and motivated to change their world for the good. Kudos to them. They have been getting into good Good trouble that is making a remarkable, tangible difference. But the journey isn't easy. In our text, the Apostle Paul, who is a seasoned warrior, a mentor, if you will, writes to his protege, Timothy, reminding him of a few things and encouraging him to keep moving forward. So the first thing he reminds Timothy of is his stellar DNA. He says, in essence, remember who your mama and grandma are. These were some mighty women of faith, and you have some great genes. Don't underestimate the impact your ancestors have had on you. In fact, I'm building on what mine instilled in me. That's kind of how I interpret some of those words in 2 Timothy 1. It's understandable that young people would become afraid and grow weary. Their work is hard. Paul acknowledges that, and he doesn't shame Timothy for sometimes wanting to fade into the background. It seems that Timothy has gotten a little despondent because Paul says he's anxious to see him happy again. Then Paul goes on to remind Timothy of what's already in his arsenal, his strong faith, and a call to remember with what he has been gifted, a spirit of strength, love, and self-control. Wow. We rarely add those to a list of qualifications now, do we? And we don't always see those qualities exhibited in people who are out to make a difference. But Paul doesn't mince words. After all, he's writing from prison. During his second imprisonment under the unhinged regime of the Roman Emperor Nero, he says there will be suffering. He goes on to emphasize that despite his own suffering, he is confident. Confident in what? In the one in whom he has put his trust. His situation was precarious. His inner state, rock solid. He goes on to urge Timothy to hold on to this pattern of sound teaching. That's the foundation. Nothing of value can outlast a quality foundation. We recoil at the thought of suffering, don't we? For good reason. There's pain. There's insecurity. It comes as a result of vulnerability. Brian McLaren, author of the book We Make the Road by Walking, puts it this way, and I quote, "Sooner or later, everyone should be arrested and imprisoned for a good cause. Or if not arrested and imprisoned, put in a position of suffering and sacrifice. Or if not that, at least be criticized or inconvenienced a little. Because if we're co-conspirators with the Spirit of God to bring blessing to our world, sooner or later, it's going to cost us something and get us in trouble." End quote. John Lewis would have agreed emphatically. He knew from childhood experience that he was not in a position to avoid suffering. His ancestors, his community bore witness to that. I believe that activism can come out of a place of privilege, but those who are accustomed to having to fight for even the most basic rights approach activism from a very different place. Now, if you're not familiar with John Lewis's history, even a cursory reading makes one thing abundantly clear. Neither he nor the young civil rights activists were lone rangers. They were part of a broad, organized, strong community that mentored their youth. One of Lewis's mentors was the Reverend Dr. James M. Lawson Jr., a contemporary of Dr. Martin Luther King. In Reverend Lawson's early years of nonviolent activism, he was sentenced to 3 years in a federal prison, serving 13 months of that when the United Methodist Church negotiated with that federal court and had him released, but they sent him directly to India. Okay. Well, here he learned the principles of Gandhi's nonviolent protest. And so he basically used his time in exile to learn the things that would support him and the black community in their struggle for freedom. He came back then to mentor young leaders such as John Lewis by teaching weekly workshops. Lawson taught them how to withstand the taunts, the slurs, and the blows of the segregationists, and to protect themselves without retaliating. Dr. King referenced Dr. Lawson as the greatest teacher of nonviolence in America. Another profound influence on Lewis's life besides the Doctors King and Lawson was A. Philip Randolph, an American labor unionist who organized and led the first successful black labor union. Remember how I mentioned that Lewis called out the Kennedy administration? Well, this displeasure didn't escape the notice of his mentors. In fact, Lewis was slated to give this speech at the March on Washington, but that speech was actually leaked. And in 1960s, leaked actually meant that several printed copies were found and began being circulated. So as his mentors read through the words, which Lewis had written, Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph spoke with Lewis, gently reminding him of what he really couldn't say. They pointed out what would be detrimental to the larger cause. Some of those words don't sound like you, John, Dr. King observed. Lewis didn't have a whole lot of time to rethink his speech. Would he carry on, certain that his youthful fire was on target and his words were justified? Or would he heed his mentors? We've come this far together, John. Let's stay together. This wasn't the urging of a passerby. This came from his trusted, seasoned mentor, A. Philip Randolph. John Lewis, 20 years old, took some of the rhetoric out of this landmark speech, refined other sections of it, and added additional material. Reflecting on it years later, in an interview with Bill Moyer, Lewis said he was certain that he did the right thing at that time. I've always been a team player. I've always tried not to violate any principles or my philosophy, Lewis explained. This active, attentive, extensive community of mentors shaped and encouraged the next generation of leaders. They could not have accomplished what they did without this solid foundation. They held on to the pattern of sound teaching, as Paul urged Timothy. And because of this, they were prepared to spend time in jail, suffer beatings, remain steadfast and unmoved when confronted with frenzied, abusive crowds. This solidity brought about the change they demanded, at least a measure of change, because we know we're still in that fight today. Parallel to David Hogg's campaign and heated rhetoric came the measured words of a longtime activist, Moms Demand Action founder Shannon Watts. Now, she mentions the long, arduous task of redefining the political landscape and what has changed in the past years already. She is mentor material, and she is behind the national organization that again took to the nation's streets, including Fresno's, in June. She doesn't call anyone out. She does not put anyone down. She simply points to the progress that has been made under her and others' leadership and points to how they go forward. Whether we like it or not, the young generation is strong, they are motivated, and it knows the culture in which it lives. The middle and older generation has seen some things, knows some things. Wisdom has come through hard slogging, through enormous challenges and setbacks. Neither is complete alone. Neither is superior. We need each other. The older generation must listen to the younger generation, and not only listen superficially, but truly hear their concerns, their critique, their vision, and their passion, and their priorities for a future in which we will not live. A future which we have already defined to a great degree through our faithful activism or our unbridled consumerism. The younger generation needs the older generation that will listen first, and only then gently give direction, ask questions, offer guidance without diminishing or invalidating, and also not simply applauding everything without further critique. This is a fine line to navigate, and this is why people like Dr. King, Dr. Lawson, and A. Philip Randolph are such giants. I understand David Hogg's sentiment. Adults who come offering to help cannot be trusted. However, long-lasting movements and the important work that benefits every neighbor will require all of us, all of our participation. Older folks, let's not be those who are untrustworthy, the ones who refuse to let go and criticize without truly listening. Young people, I invite you to the table to share your vision, your frustration, your fears, your dreams, your hopes. And I invite you to listen and to learn as you teach and share with us. None of us want to look back, whether that's a lifetime of many decades or just a few years. We don't want to look back with the lament of if only we had listened. The best time to listen is now. Make the time. Carve out the time, the space. Be adaptive and creative so we can agree with Brian McLaren when he writes, "When a crisis hits, unprepared people may be paralyzed with fear, but we'll set an example of confidence and peace." May it be so.